There is so much that I want. I want to be well.
He makes me lie down in green pastures.
I am tired of laying here. I wish I could get out of bed.
He leads me beside still waters.
I feel like I'm in a whirlpool.
He restores my soul.
Restore my health too, Lord.
He leads me in right paths for his name's sake.
I feel lost.
Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me.
Please don't leave me. I'm afraid, and it is lonely and dark at night.
Your rod and staff comfort me.
It seems like such a long journey.
You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies.
I hope my appetite comes back.
You anoint my head with oil.
Please wipe my brow with a cool cloth.
My cup overflows.
My mouth is so dry. May I have a drink of water?
Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life.
How many days will that be?
And I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Help me to go home, Lord.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you. And with that, I hope is a good connection to our speaker, who I'm very happy to introduce, who's going to be speaking to us on themes of healing and spirituality. I'm happy to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Angela Bratton, who teaches anthropology at Augusta University. Her doctoral research centered around issues of sexuality and health and gender in West Africa. She currently teaches classes on migration, on identity, on the anthropology of medicine, and on my favorite, the anthropology of food. And she's going to give our sermon today, and I want to add she's graciously agreed to a discussion at 12:30 after our service. So if you want to talk more, you can return here to the sanctuary at that time. Dr. Bratton.
Good morning. Thank you all for inviting me to be here this morning. I'm very excited to get to talk about a couple of my favorite things, Africa and spirituality, and maybe I'll throw in a Star Wars reference, and then it'll be a trifecta later on of my favorite things. So today I'm going to talk about community and a way that we need to, a way that we see in Africa healing that is used to heal whole communities as well as individuals in a spiritual sense, and thinking about how as a society we can create more healthy spiritual societies. And I'm going to do this through some examples of looking at spiritual healing within Africa. And later at the very end of the talk, I am going to talk about warfare and just in a very general term about violence that is experienced in warfare, and then I'll talk about healing practices that are traditional in Africa to help people heal from those. So, of course, I have to start out, as I do in all my classes and all my talks about Africa, it is a continent, not a country, and it is about 54 countries at the moment. So my point is with that is that it's very large and it's very diverse. There's a lot of different cultures. So in just the few minutes that I have available, of course, I will make some generalizations about that, and I will also give some specific examples throughout, but just be aware that it is extremely diverse continent. So to think about spiritual healing, we need to understand a few things about religion in Africa. So let me start there. I kind of joke that there are no atheists in Africa, and I say joke because I'm sure there's one somewhere, but just to kind of give you a contrast in terms of where we are in the United States and kind of our larger just cultural thinking versus the general cultural thinking in Africa, is that here in the U.S., people tend to ask questions, well, does God exist? Is there a spirit? Is there an unseen world that we can't measure with science? Do they exist at all? Whereas in Africa, that's not typically the question. The question more often is going to be, what does that world look like? It's not a question of existence, it's more of a question of how does it work? And so just a very different mindset in some ways from our larger culture here in the US. So spirits exist everywhere in Africa. There's sort of a recognition of that, regardless of your education level, regardless of whether you live in the city or the country. There's just this general recognition that spirits are everywhere, and magic as well. And that this is very much a part of the fabric of contemporary life and culture within Africa. This is not something that is relegated to, say, the 1600s in Europe, but that it is part of everyday life today. So traditionally speaking, we talk about animism. Animism is a term that's used to refer to, you can use it as a synonym for traditional practices. So we could talk about Native American religions as being animistic. We can talk about traditional Asian cultures, their religious practice being animistic. So animism is just sort of this general term. One of the things that I think is interesting for the theme that I want to bring out today in terms of community is how animism incorporates the ancestors into the spiritual world, and very much recognizing and honoring on a regular basis the ancestors. So in animistic practices, typically, again, very generalized here, there is a recognition and honoring in some way of the ancestors. Ceremonies, food may be given, all sorts of different practices. And the ancestors help their living descendants with issues that they're having. They want their descendants to be successful, right? This is their lineage. So it's in the ancestors' interest to see their descendants prosper. But it's also in the interest of the descendants to make sure that the ancestors are being remembered. Because at one point in time, we're all going to be ancestors, right? So we don't want to be forgotten. And the ancestors work to connect the people that are alive with the spirits. And so there are spirits that may indwell in a variety of different places. It may be geographic places like water, rocks, trees. It could be specific locations in a particular community. And then there are the deities, so like the creator god. And so in animistic practices, there are these different levels of spirit beings that people may connect to. So in Africa, when we talk about traditional African religions, we're talking at some level of that kind of worldview. But I would be remiss if I didn't point out that there has been a long history of Christianity and Islam within Africa as well, particularly Coptic Christianity dating back to the 1st century in northeastern Africa, and later influences, of course, and Islam also has been in Africa for hundreds of years. And so there's also strong populations of Jews in North Africa and South Africa, as well as Hindus in South Africa. And so syncretism, right, is also the blending of these religions. And so you see a lot of that in Africa as well. So when somebody gets sick, they will oftentimes go to a traditional healer on Monday, go to maybe even the medical doctor on Tuesday, and then go to the spiritual healer for their tradition on Wednesday. And they cover all the bases, and there's no sense in which one should be left out or that there's any contradiction between those. There's also sort of a recognition that they're dealing with different things. The medical doctors may be more focused on on the physical body, whereas the spiritual healer is going to get at the root cause of what's going on, which is something related to the spirit and the community. So I just wanted to kind of set that foundation for understanding the different perspectives that are shaping what healing may look like in Africa. So one of the ways to kind of think about the spirit world in Africa also is to recognize that people accumulate energy, or we might say the force, of this less visible world. And many believe that these powers, these energies, are very, very awesome and at times dangerous, but they can be managed. And these can be managed through the cult priests, the healers, but they can also be managed through the witches and the sorcerers who cause some of the bad magic to happen. So there is agreement typically that these powers of the spirit world and the magic can be harnessed through extensive training. And these could be not only the cult priests, but also herbal medicine, diviners, to help heal people. So if one is in need of spiritual healing, what may be the cause of the problem, of the illness? Well, there's a real sense that we as humans are tripartite beings in Africa. And I'm going to guess that many of us in this room probably would agree with that, although again, it's not necessarily the consensus in our larger culture. And when I say we're tripartite, I mean that we have a physical body, we have a mental self, right, our psychological perception of ourself, but also our spirit. I don't think I've ever, I think I'd remember this, but I don't remember ever having been to the medical doctor and being asked, well, how is your spirit today? Have you sinned lately? You know, have you, what's the condition of your relationship with God? Not had that experience in a medical doctor's office, right? But the healing that we see in Africa does incorporate this sense of, well, what is my relationship with the spirit world, you know, that community, but also my relationship with my physical community, right? My neighbors, my family members. And so that's an important part of that healing process, because oftentimes illness is blamed on some sort of break with those social relationships. So let me just clarify that in Africa, witchcraft is a term, of course, it's an English term that translates into a lot of different African languages, but it is a general catch-all for what's considered to be bad magic. There are no good witches, right? Glinda is not in Africa. Glinda the Good Witch, Harry Potter is not in Africa. But I want to also be clear that there is good magic. It's just that the term used for people who harness good magic is witch doctors, is kind of an old term for that. But those are people who are doctoring people who have been affected by the negative consequences of witchcraft. Or as I mentioned earlier, a more specific term would be a cult priest or priestess, who are the traditional healers within these communities. And so witchcraft is often related, as I said, to a break in the social relationships. In fact, one of the first things that often comes up in discussions of an illness of some sort is somebody jealous of you? And you can't always control who's jealous of you, but that is oftentimes one of the things that people look at, will consider when they're trying to heal somebody. And it was interesting because in South Africa, there was a rise of witchcraft-blamed illnesses after apartheid was over, because for so many years, under the injustice of apartheid, people had a common enemy that they focused on. You know, that the outside, this apartheid system was oppressing them. When that was dismantled, though, there was more of this return to this traditional notions that it was witchcraft that was to blame, and jealousy as a result of that, because people were struggling more between each other, right? That as bad as apartheid was, now people, instead of fighting this one common enemy, began to fight each other again. So that was an interesting sort of flip of that script there. So jealousy is one of the major reasons why, as I said, people may be dealing with a type of physical illness or a mental illness or something that's related to a spiritual cause. Because remember, they're all interconnected in this worldview. And the people accused of being witches at times are also, interestingly enough, outside of the typical norms of the social circle. For example, it's not unusual that it would be somebody who's a widow, maybe somebody who is either childless or who's lost their children. Maybe their children are not there in the community anymore, they've moved away. But it's somebody who's not fitting into the normal social rhythms of the society. And I think that that's significant to consider. So what do these spiritual ills look like? Well, of course, they can manifest in physical ways. There's all sorts of, any sort of physical symptom that you can imagine may be how one may experience that break and what it feels like to be sick. and cause them to go and seek a traditional healer who's going to ask them those questions about their relationships and about their spirit. And speaking of health, spirit possession can be invited or not, but healers will often use a trance-like state to engage and invite a spirit in to help with the diagnosis and the healing of the individual who's sick. It's a way to sort of channel those powers of knowledge and of healing. And a couple of examples of this that I think are really interesting is that in the Kung community in the Kalahari in southern Africa, they have healing rituals that last all night long. So it's important to remember that the Kung are a group of egalitarian people who are hunters and gatherers. And so egalitarian, I think, is a really important part of this equation in terms of how it works. But they live in communities of about 25 to 50 people, so small-knit communities. And if somebody is feeling ill, or even sometimes as a way to prevent illness, they will have all-night trance ceremonies where the healers go into these trances, harness the energy to make sure that people are either healed or well, or stay well if they are not sick already. But here's the thing I want to focus on is that's the whole community involved. And I think that that's really important lesson that we in our culture can take away from that. The whole community spends the entire night focused sometimes just on one individual to help them through that difficulty that they're going through. And it's also interesting that as an egalitarian society, everybody has access to health care, right? Nobody's left out of that process. Another example comes from the Sudan, so this is more towards Northeast Africa. But there they have what's called the Czar Cult. And this is where this is an area where you have primarily people who are practicing Muslims, but they have syncretized and blended their version of Islam with traditional animistic practices. And so in this particular healing cult, it's a way for women to deal with marital and fertility problems that they come across. So in these societies, these very patriarchal societies, women don't have a lot of freedom to talk about what concerns them, right? To initiate a lot of change, except through the power of the Czar Cult. And so in this context, they will experience spirit possession. And when they don't have a voice, the spirit, through that possession, can speak on their behalf and explain to the community around them, these are the concerns and these are the problems. And then people take that very seriously. They may not always take her seriously, but they take that's a whole nother discussion. But they take the spirit seriously and then can negotiate some ways to remedy what's going on in her marriage and her household. And even as she struggles with perhaps infertility. So, despite their subordinate status, they get that help from the community, helping them to heal physically, psychologically, and as well as spiritually and socially in that community setting. So what happens when these spiritual issues have seriously damaged an entire community? Perhaps during a war, particularly civil war. I always like to point out to my students that, what you see in the news is oftentimes pictures of war in Africa, but that's only a fraction. I just want to remind you of that. That's only a fraction of Africa. But it is a very real part of those places in Africa. So how can you find justice and how can you find healing when an entire community has been ravaged by war? And while we may not have experienced war here on our soil in many years, there are lots of ways that social injustice, like racism, for example, still exist. And, we're still dealing, we still need to have those discussions in terms of how to heal as a community. So, in the United States, I would make the argument that, again, from a larger cultural perspective, we tend to have an emphasis on punishing people when they've done something wrong and seeking revenge. Think about our judicial system. Our judicial system is set up to find guilt or to find who is to blame, even if it's a civil lawsuit. Whereas an example I'm going to give you from Mozambique shows us a way in which instead of focusing on that, we can talk about healing and restorative justice for the entire community. Carolyn Nordstrom is an anthropologist at Notre Dame who studies war. Most anthropologists like myself are looking for a little bit more peaceful places to go, but she intentionally seeks out those conflict zones and can provide some really interesting insights into those areas. In her book, A Different Kind of War Story, she notes that war and violence are deeply personal experiences, and of course, they dehumanize individuals as well. Mozambique is in southeastern Africa, and she focuses on the civil war, or I should say the warfare and conflict that happened there for about 30 years. It started out as a war of independence from Portugal. There was a few years of respite, and then they delved into a civil war that spanned until the early 90s. In the context of this, they were able to use traditional healing practices to help heal their communities and to integrate people who were devastated by their experience, often by those very dehumanizing experiences, back into the social fabric of their communities. And they used a lot of creativity in this as well. Because, as you may imagine, what happens in the case like civil war is that you have kids who are kidnapped out of their households, and they are turned into those child soldiers that you've heard about. And those child soldiers grow up to do very horrible, dehumanizing, and despicable things. The war ends. How do you bring that person back into the community? Because remember, that person who has perpetuated some horrible things was also a victim himself. And so the communities there were trying to figure out how to heal that individual, but also heal the damage that those individuals had, perpetuated on other people. It's a hard space to be in, but creatively and using those traditional healing practices, they were able to do that. So, one of the things that I've been struck by anytime I think about some of these Civil War examples is that, and I don't know why 30 years seems to be the magic number, but a lot of times in Africa, 30 years, around that seems to be the length of time of some of these wars. But you've got an entire generation of children that are lost to this process of violence, right? Their concept of norm is constant warfare. And so thinking about how you can heal those individuals, right? What does a normal social fabric look like after that period of time takes creativity to be able to reimagine. How can you live in peace if you've never experienced peace? So in this particular example in Mozambique, people began fighting the war instead of fighting each other. And that was a very important turning point when people got to the point they're like, we're tired of this. They figured out who the real enemy was, and it wasn't the combatant who was kidnapped at the age of 12, right? It was the war itself. And so unity was defined against the enemy. And community continually came behind the individuals who were victims to let them know that they were not alone and not to blame for what had happened to them in the process of this war. Numerous rituals were performed to help these people heal, and I'll give you just a few examples before I conclude. So one example were rituals that reconstructed the marriage bed to symbolize for folks who had been homeless, right? They had been, their homes had been destroyed in this process of civil war, that the marriage bed represented continuity and comfort of family, even if all their family wasn't accounted for or present, but there were rituals that helped to invoke those feelings. There were cleansing ceremonies to bring physical and emotional healing to the child soldiers, many of whom, of course, were grown men at this point. But there were, very strategic attempts to reintegrate them back into the rhythms of daily life in a stable society, which, of course, as I said, they knew nothing of. To, as one person said, quote, to take the war out of them, end quote. There was a recognition that to harbor revenge and hatred would only fan the flames of violence. Community recognized that if soldiers were banished from the community, they would only continue to resort to violence to survive. And also, healing rituals were performed on women who were kidnapped and sexually assaulted. And one of these rituals were bringing them back into a community, whether it was their home community or a new one that was being established in this peacetime. They were bathed multiple times by other women during a ceremony to cleanse their body and their spirit. And they were accompanied by songs about healing from trauma, reclaiming a new life, and they were given new clothes as sort of this final, they were pushing them back into this new space with this new identity as somebody who is no longer a victim, but now somebody who's in the process of being healed. And she is constantly reminded that what happened to her was done by the war, not through anything that she had done herself. There's no sense of victimizing the victim. So I will leave you with 3 proverbs about unity and community. And it's very important to think about working together to help people to find healing and to dismantle the societal structures that perpetuate injustice, conflict, and violence. And I had trouble figuring out if I wanted to just leave with this one or to include all 3. So I couldn't choose a favorite, so I'm going to use all 3 of these proverbs, and hopefully they'll all resonate with you in one way or another. The first proverb comes from the Congo, and it says, "A single bracelet does not jingle," which I think is kind of a fun way to kind of think about the importance of community working together and the harmony. And you can kind of, even from a musical standpoint, think about that. Another proverb was, "Cross the river in a crowd and the crocodile won't eat you." And the third one was, "If you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together." So how much further could our community go by working together? Thank you.